Color can set the mood for your piece, evoke emotion, and ultimately can make or break your art. But how do colors work? Which colors look good together? How can you, as an artist, master color? As someone who, despite my many art weaknesses, has a lot of experience working with color, I'll be answering these questions today. This video will be divided into two main parts: how you can learn color theory and how I apply color in my illustrations. But first, let's define a few key terms. Hue is, in simple terms, the color that you're using. This is a red hue. This is a blue hue. This is a purple hue, and so on. Saturation is the intensity and vibrancy of a color. As you can see here, this bright, intense red has a lot of saturation, while this toned down, duller red has a lot less saturation. Essentially, saturation is just how powerful a color can be, and can be a great way to highlight the focal points of your pieces. And finally, value is basically just another word for brightness, how light or dark a color can be. The darker the color, the higher the value. Values are a great way to create contrast, and we can check our values using grayscale filters. Now that we've defined these simple terms, let's take a quick look at color impact. Colors can depict many scenes and emotions, and depending on what vibe you want to go for in your art, your colors can vary. Each color has a common meaning and emotion behind it. For example, red can represent passion and danger, while blue can represent calmness and stability. Warmer colors can represent more aggressive emotions, while colder colors can represent calmer or sadder emotions, and adding these colors to bring emotion in your piece will greatly impact your atmosphere. But what color combinations go well together? Well, that's where color harmony comes into play. The color wheel is extremely helpful towards this, since it can provide a lot of nice color combinations. There's monochromatic color schemes, which is the use of one hue with varying levels of saturation and value. Using complementary colors, which are colors opposite each other on the color wheel, is a great way to make elements stand out, create contrast, and bring life into your art. Another nice color combination is analogous, which are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. Of course, there are a bunch of other combinations with very complicated names as well. But you don't need to remember all of that, or even what I just discussed in my opinion. All you need to remember is that opposites attract. Using multiple pairs of analogous colors in your pieces, or a mix of complementary and analogous in your work, are great ways to create contrast in your art. Understanding how colors interact, or color context, can take you a step further. Color is very dependent on its surroundings. The same color can look darker on a brighter background, but brighter on a darker background. When certain colors are placed next to each other, it can create an illusion of depth. To make your pieces even more atmospheric, you can also make use of aerial perspective, which also depends on your color context and background. Essentially, the objects in the back get lighter, more saturated, and their colors become closer to the backgrounds. It's also important to know that the colors of your character can depend on their environment, so you should give your characters a similar hue to the environment to immerse them even further. Using color palettes and different values can bring a lot of contrast to your piece, but it's also very, and I mean very important, to balance the contrast. Think of the feeling that you want to convey in your piece and choose the appropriate colors and contrasts to match. Within warm and cool colors, you should emphasize one of them for the majority of your piece and add flashes of the other to create some contrast. Not everything should pop out, so our eyes can rest and focus on the main point. Fundamentals aside, how else can you improve your knowledge and use of colors? An amazing way to learn how to use them and how to improve at art in general is to study real-life photos or other artists who are good at color. Artists such as the Okama, Mika Picasso, Matcha, and Reedham all excel at color. And after doing some studies, you'll begin to notice some common palettes that are used, and you can apply them in your art. Now that we've gotten the basics down, let me show you how I apply them in my work. I'll show you two methods of how I do color, how I set colors up, and how I color correct. Keep in mind that this is how I do color. It isn't necessarily the right or wrong way to do it, just how I like to work. You don't have to color like I do. This is just an example of how I apply all this knowledge into my art. First, let's take a look at how I set colors up. After finding a reference to draw my OC Mimi in, I did a sketch and base colors. Then, I asked myself, what atmosphere do I want to convey? I wanted to create a warm and serene atmosphere with a lot of sun, and since the character is submerged in water here, the majority of this piece should be in this turquoise-ish color. So, what other colors can we use to create this effect? Remember, opposites attract. Using an orangish yellow will create a lot of contrast and bring in the warmth that I want. Now that we've figured out the two main colors that we want to use, I set a layer to multiply and filled it in with turquoise, adjusted the opacity to my liking, and painted in the areas with light with the orange color. Next, I emphasized the shading a bit, making some sections darker. But how can we push this even further? We can use analogous colors. I selected the color of the shadows, shifted the hue to a color next to it, and added this in the shadows. The value is still the same, but the shadows have become more interesting. I like to use a brush with pressure opacity since you can control the amount of color that you want. You can see me applying this once again with the warmer colors, where I shifted the hue and adjusted the saturation slightly, applying it as a transition color between the shadows and light. To further push the lighting, I created an add layer and used warmer colors in the sections with light. Now that the base lighting and shading are complete, let's amp up the atmosphere of this piece. To create a sense of cohesion, I used the overlay layer mode, filled it with turquoise, and adjusted the opacity to my liking. I then used that orange color once again in the warmer areas, and used some yellow to emphasize the focal point. At this point, the colors are looking pretty good, so I just applied some extra effects. And now, this piece's colors are set up and it's all ready for rendering. I won't be showing you how I render, because I have no clue how I render either. But here's a trick that I use to keep colors cohesive during the process. Glazing, or layering different colors to create new hues. I usually like to add colors from the background into my subject, but sometimes the background's colors on the subject may look very unnatural just sitting by themselves. Layering is a great way to deal with this. Using a brush with pressure opacity, you can zoom in between the two colors that you want, select the in-between color, and layer it in as much as you'd like. Just selecting colors like this can be extremely intimidating though, and you might not feel confident with this method for the first few tries. But don't worry, I'll show you how you can adjust the colors of your finished piece to be more fun and eye-catching by using the Holy Trinity: layer modes, curves, and hue saturation, brightness, or color balance. Here's a piece that I did of Thanos from Squid Game before any color adjustments. The rendering's nice, but there's not much contrast. So, what can we do to push the colors? This piece is mostly yellow and gold. Remember, opposites attract, so it's probably a good idea to include some purple here. First, let's duplicate the layers and merge them together. Then, I'm gonna use the Curves tool to adjust the colors. Essentially, the Curves tool allows you to adjust the brightness, contrast, and color balance of an image. There's a lot of color schemes that you can adjust to, so try it out until you find one that you like. Then, I'll set this layer to color or normal, adjust opacity to my liking, and erase out bits that I don't want to keep. I'll continue this process over and over again until I get to a setup that I like. To push the colors even further, I'll use layer modes, such as Add to make things more saturated and brighter, Multiply to darken areas, and Overlay to emphasize and make colors pop out. This is pretty much just trial and error. You can try out different colors and blend modes until you get a result that you like. But make sure to keep in mind the color and contrast rules when you do this. Opposites attract, and you should balance out your values, saturation, and warm and cool colors. An optional step is to also use the hue, saturation, brightness, or color balance sliders, but I typically don't use them that much. Or, if you're an artist who uses grayscale, you can also use gradient maps in your work to make coloring easier. And by combining these steps and some trial and error, you get a pretty nice result. Learning color theory is all about experimentation and seeing what works best for you. There are no rules in art. These are just some guidelines to help you choose your colors and create atmosphere in your work. Follow your heart in your art, because that is where the best ideas start. And remember, opposites attract. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this video was helpful, that you learned something new, and that you have an amazing day.